This video is adapted from a final essay that I had to write for a master's course called Problems of Literary Criticism, and it is about or influenced by French theory. So that's just kind of a preface before I get into this. It's a paper I was kind of fond of. There's probably some stuff in it people won't agree with and won't like and will call me stupid over, but that's okay. I hope you enjoy it, and okay, I'm going to start now. Thank you. In his essay, The Third Meaning, Roland Barthes explores some of the ways in which meaning and interpretation can be derived from film due to multiple forms of sensory information put out by film as opposed to text, and the various manners in which that sensory information goes on to shape the individual interpretation or reception of the film, based not only on feeling upon the individual's viewing of a film, but also based on the allusions and connections the film, intentionally or unintentionally, makes impact the viewer's derivation of meaning from the film's text. The manner in which Barthes characterizes this particular problem of film applies well to the perception of the 2016 superhero film Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, written by Chris Terrio and directed by Zack Snyder. There are multiple layers of subtext and exploration of abstract ideas in Snyder's film, which are conveyed in all manner of ways Barthes highlights as potential manners from which to derive meaning in his essay. Many of these layers of subtext, however, which go on to boldly inform the general course, direction, and thematic mechanics of Snyder's film, are neglected by most critics of the film who do not interpret the same meaning from Snyder's symbols and use of illusion and sensory connection. Though a similar exploration can be made regarding how effective subtext is, or how often it should be used to prop a film's major ideas and plot, it is much more difficult to argue against the presence of such subtext in Snyder's film, and the drastic impact they have on an audience member's perception of that film. Though the film is subtitled Dawn of Justice, the question of true justice is explored almost entirely through the subtext of the film rather than through thematic or character-driven reflection. Because of this, such commentary on the theme of justice is limited exclusively to the film's subtext and allusions to other works, which requires the use of various Marxist, feminist, political, and racial readings in order for one to fully obtain what Barthes describes as the obtuse, or third meaning, with the first two forms of meaning being the information level, which is what is literally happening, and the symbolic level, the meaning or interpretation the author wants the viewer to perceive. Of the third level, the obtuse, Barthes writes, "The obtuse meaning is not in the language system. Take away the obtuse meaning and communication and signification still remain, still circulate, still come through. Without it, I can still state and read. No more, however, is it to be located in language use. It may be that there is a certain constant in obtuse meaning, but in that case it is already a thematic language, an ideolect, the ideolect being provisional. Obtuse meanings are to be found not everywhere, but somewhere, in authors of films, perhaps in a certain end of reading life, and so reality itself." Barthes' third meaning is particularly important when examining Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice through a critical lens if the critic is actually aiming to understand and engage with the film's dialogue. Categorically and unapologetically panned by both critics and fans upon its release, Snyder's film is by no means flawless, but it holds the viewer responsible for a certain degree of critical evaluatory and reading skills necessary to comprehension of the film's language that many instead viewed as examples of poor writing, thus entirely ignoring Barthes' obtuse meaning, which is essential to fully understanding the film and its functions. Screenwriter Chris Terrio, the man responsible for penning the script to director Zack Snyder's film, highlighted this misunderstanding of the film well in a recent interview with Vanity Fair, where he highlighted one scene in particular involving the character of Lois Lane, portrayed by Amy Adams, as being an example of how he feels his film was mistreated by critics and fans upon release. Once the critics decide a movie is incoherent, it's just a pile on. Then they attack everything. There's a line at the beginning of the film where a warlord says to Lois Lane, "They didn't tell me that the interview was with a lady." And Lois replies, "I'm not a lady, I'm a journalist." So one reviewer held up this line as proof positive of my stupidity and my inability to write Lois, or to write at all. Well, the character of Lois in the movie was inspired by the journalist Marie Colvin, who was of course killed in Syria. She was one of the most intrepid journalists who ever lived, in my opinion. And there's a story in Vanity Fair, Marie Colvin's Private War, by Marie Brenner, and the line that Lois says is almost exactly the line that was in that article, where a Chechen warlord said he wouldn't shake her hand because she was a woman. Marie Colvin replied, "There is no woman in this room, only a journalist." So that line was my tribute to her. Then in the pile-on, a line like that is held as proof positive that I don't understand either women or journalists or human beings, and that I'm a shitty writer. This particular scene, which comes early in the film, is important to the film's depiction of justice for a number of reasons, as it subtly sets up and raises questions about how the film is going to depict justice in regard to feminism, colonialism, the military-industrial complex, and of course superpowered beings from other planets. However, nearly all this setup is dependent on the viewer's understanding of Lois Lane's line to the African warlord. In the film's first scene prominently featuring a woman, her credentials are questioned due to her gender, which Lois pushes back against by establishing herself as first and foremost a journalist. This is the interpretive layer of meaning. The symbolic layer is to establish Lois Lane as an independent, take-no-nonsense personality, and the obtuse layer is to form a connection between fictional reporter Lois Lane and real-world reporter Marie Colvin. Now, Tara's suggestion that he simply included the line as a tribute to Colvin may be true, but the inclusion of the line also requires an awareness of what such a connotation brings to not only the character of Lois Lane, but the entire situation being depicted on screen and the rest of the film as a whole. The reason for this being that the conflict shown in this scene of the film lays the groundwork for nearly every conflict depicted in the rest of the film's 3-hour running time. By associating Lane with Colvin, Terrio is asking the audience to form a connection between the two women's situations. In doing so, he is supplying the audience with an expectation that the two situations will end similarly, mainly that Lois Lane is not going to survive this encounter. This expectation should only grow more solid as the situation continues to devolve. Along for the interview with Lois' photographer Jimmy Olsen, who early on has his camera taken from him by Russian operative, DC Comics character Anatoly Kanayev, otherwise known as the KG Beast, who appears to be on the side of the African warlord. Kanayev exposes Olsen's film, much to Olsen's instant protest, chagrin, and alarm. Kanayev then smashes Olsen's camera to reveal a piece of tracking hardware inside, which results in guns from the warlord's soldiers being raised and Lane's interview coming to a halt. The revelation here is that Olsen is not simply a photographer. He is a CIA operative assigned to Lois' interview without Lois' knowledge. Olsen has been authorized to negotiate peace talks with the warlord and insists Lois has nothing to do with the situation. Olsen is then shot in the head and Lois is taken captive. The film then reveals that Olsen was being supervised by U.S. military personnel and that, upon his death, their objective is to kill the African warlord by means of bombardment, the same manner in which Marie Colvin and photographer Remy Olchuk died in 2012, though the nature of that bombardment still falls under more dubious circumstances than that depicted by Terrio and Snyder in Dawn of Justice. At this point, Kanayev and his men kill the African soldiers and villagers in the area, spraying the helpless citizens with machine gun fire. They torch the bodies with flamethrowers and flee the scene. As military action escalates, none other than Superman himself enters the conflict and saves Lois Lane's life. Though he does not arrive until the scene's final moments, Superman and his presence are nonetheless the second most important aspect of the scene, as his intervention raises the first and largest question of justice which will be explored later in the film. What gives him the right to intervene? Additionally, the inclusion of Superman in the scene's resolution is a subversion of the expectations Terrio built by paralleling his film to the Colvin situation. In subverting the resolution of that scenario, Terrio is telling the audience that Superman has irrevocably altered the manner in which justice is carried out in the world of the film. This may seem obvious, but Barthes' obtuse aspect becomes important when evaluating the nature of the world depicted by Terrio and Snyder. The environment inhabited by his iteration DC characters is meant to reflect the real world and its politics or morals as closely as possible, raising the assertion that had Superman not been there, Lois Lane would have suffered the fate of Marie Colvin, but that, because Superman intervened, the world itself is/would be changed forever, and as a result, justice will be forced to take on a new definition. In the scene, which is essentially Superman's introduction in the film, Terrio and Snyder are not framing Superman as a savior-like figure, or the traditional Superman saves the cat-esque figure audiences are used to from the Diner and Reeve era of Superman cinema. Instead, Superman is depicted as an extension of American imperialism and interventionist politics, and though Superman decries that association later in the film and says he was acting in the best interest of Lois, his actions nonetheless raise the question of what his role can and should be in international politics and warfare. Superman is, of course, a deeply rooted American icon and cultural symbol, both in the real world and in Snyder's world. Because of this, it is impossible for the audience, or the characters inhabiting Snyder's globe, to disassociate Superman from American ideals. For instance, Christopher Reeves' interpretation of the character helped popularize Superman's catchphrase for standing for truth, justice, and the American way. This is a phrase which originated with the character in comics from the 1930s, though at that time it simply read as truth and justice. The American Way wasn't added until a 1940s radio show adaptation, when America was locked deep in the conflict of World War II. The addition of the American Way is a product of a time that is historically viewed as black and white. America needed to intervene to stop the inarguable evil of Hitler and the Nazis. There were few public discussions about the morality of America's role in the conflict. And given the nature of superheroes in comics, especially icons like Superman, were used to bolster morale and were essentially propagandic mouthpieces for the war cause. Because of this and his character as a whole, Superman has always been depicted as a simple, earnest farm boy just doing the right thing because it's the right thing, much like 1940s America with little to no questions asked and no impact on his personal feelings or psyche. This is not the version of Superman Snyder has chosen to depict in his film. And Superman's interference in the Africa incident highlights this. As Terrio explained in the Vanity Fair interview, without sounding too political, it's not lost on me that much like a drone, Superman sort of comes from out of nowhere from the sky and vanquishes his enemies and then flies off with no consequences. This idea is explored later in the film by the public's reaction, and in particular, a scene in which Superman's clearly heroic acts are nonetheless cut vividly against a montage of Superman being critiqued and attacked by various mainstream political pundits such as Anderson Cooper and Charlie Rose. One pundit asks us Superman,
"Are there any moral constraints on this person? We have international law. On this earth, every act is a political act."
The same question could be asked of anything from the use of a nuclear bomb, the power of a sitting US president, or even the death of a reporter. Snyder's world is complex, and there is no simple truth for Superman, no black and white justice, and no clear-cut American way.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe. There's more at stake here than just our lives, Clark, or the lives of those around us. When the world finds out what you can do, it's going to change everything. Our beliefs, our notions of what it means to be human, everything. You saw how Pete's mom reacted, right? She was scared of Clark.
At the end of the montage, Clark Kent turns off his television in shame and calls his mother in the middle of the night. After a moment of questioning himself, he asks Martha Kent,
"How come Dad never left Kansas?"
to which he responds,
Oh, he just, you know how he was. What do I need to travel for? I'm already there.
and Clark says,
"Just wish it was more simple."
My baby boy. Nothing was ever simple.
Once more, this conversation is not only about Superman himself, but the morals and attitudes which he represents as an extension of American ideals in the 21st century. Ideals which, more often than not, are carried out by the United States military, as depicted in the previously mentioned scene. What gives America the right to determine what is best, or just, for another country it does not know or understand? Jimmy Olsen, who in this situation represents the United States government while Super represents the United States military in pervading ideas about justice, is killed for his efforts to meddle in international affairs, and Superman becomes the subject of controversy, fear, and hatred. Additionally, it is important to note that the actions and presence of Knyzev were facilitated by billionaire Lex Luthor, with the goal of framing Superman for destroying the entire village and turning American and world public sentiment against him. Because of this, Superman is called to participate in a public trial at the U.S. Capitol, overseen by fictional Democratic Senator from Kentucky, June Finch, portrayed by actress Holly Hunter. When Superman arrives at the Capitol for his trial, Snyder treats it as a momentous and incredible moment. But at this point, using Barthes' obtuse derivation of meaning, the audience knows that it is not Superman who is on trial, but all of America, on trial against itself, and all the various ways in which it attempts to perpetuate justice. Terrio decides to open the trial with a speech from Senator Finch, who says,
"This is how a democracy works. We talk to each other. We act by the consent of the governed, sir. I have sat here before to say that shadow interventions will not be tolerated by this committee. Neither will lies. Because today is a day for truth."
At this point in her speech, however, Finch begins to lose her place and stutter as she realizes what is a jar full of human urine labeled Granny's Peach Tea has been placed on her desk by Luthor, at which point the Capitol is destroyed in an explosion and everyone inside, with the exception of Superman, is killed. There are a number of interesting themes in Terrio's destruction of the US Capitol. On display is an intersection of political commentary on the state of the US justice system, feminism, and a Marxist or classist angle that will appear again later in the film. This is also the point at which the film begins to make some definitive statements regarding all of these pieces of the film's wider essentialized subtext that were first introduced in the film's Africa sequence. Specifically, this is where the character of June Finch meets her end, and the villain Lex Luthor, a Silicon Valley-esque billionaire, firmly establishes himself as the film's antagonist. And as the film's antagonist, Luthor engages quite a bit with the film's protagonist, but the character engages with most is not Superman, but instead, the senator from Kentucky, Miss June Finch. Women are at the forefront of Batman v Superman. Lois Lane is the one who uncovers Lex Luthor's meddling in Africa. June Finch is the first and only character to attempt confronting Luthor until Bruce Wayne meets him at the end of the film. Superman calls his mother for support and goes to Lois when he feels broken. And lastly, the resolution for the two forms of justice, those depicted through the titular heroes themselves, is the shared name of their mothers.
Save Martha!
In all three of his DC films, director Zack Snyder gives his female characters an agency not traditionally held by their comic book or cultural counterparts. For instance, in Batman v Superman's predecessor Man of Steel, the opening sequence sees the birth of Kal-El, Superman, on the planet Krypton to his father Jor-El and mother Laura-El, keeping in tradition with his comic book counterpart. Where the film differs from the source material, however, is in its treatment of Laura. Traditionally, it is Jor-El who is credited with sending Superman to Earth. In Man of Steel, however, Snyder gives this duty to Laura.
Laura, listen to me. The Codex is Krypton's future. Abort the launch!
This decision is a minor detail most viewers will not take account of, and which only becomes apparent when analyzing how Snyder decides to portray the women in his films. Both Laura and Jor are introduced in the same scene, the birth of Superman. Obviously, it is Laura who gives birth to the titular character, and later remarks how she no longer feels she can follow through on her and Jor-El's plan to sell Kal to Earth, saying,
"But if the ship doesn't make it, he'll die out there, alone. I can't do it. I thought I could, but
Laura.
not if he's here."
The emotional weight given to Laura's decision and the depiction of it as sacrifice is something the character had never been given before. A similar emphasis is put on Martha Kent and Lois Lane in Batman v Superman. Both women are the sole guides for Superman's moral actions and questions about his upbringing. While Man of Steel does illustrate the role of strong and independent women in the life of Superman, it is still a film predominantly focused on the teaching of Superman's two fathers. In Batman v Superman, however, the focus is on the teaching of mothers. The film does not disclose whether or not June Finch is a mother, a wife, etc., nor does it need to, as this information is not relevant to her role as a woman in the film. Just as Lois is a journalist, not a lady, Finch is a senator, not a lady. Yet, what is important to this depiction of Finch is her incorruptibility. Throughout the film, she grapples with all of the very same and complex philosophical questions as the rest of the characters, but early on shows she's the only one willing to take a firm, but fair approach to the matter of Superman. Introduced in the same scene as antagonist Lex Luthor, Senator Finch meets with the billionaire to discuss the use of kryptonite as a possible deterrent against Superman. Luthor insists on selling it to the US government for weaponization and to be used in order to kill Superman. Senator Finch, while still voicing her concerns about Superman, does not take the bait. A second senator present at the meeting, however, Senator Barrows, a man, meets with Luthor after the fact and makes a backdoor deal to get the kryptonite from Luthor. This is not dissimilar to the shadow interventions mentioned by Senator Finch in her final speech. It is also a piece of Terrio and Snyder's commentary on the influence corrupt billionaires with selfish motives have on political decision-making in the United States. The influence of Luthor on Senator Barrows, as well as him being directly responsible for the destruction of the Capitol during Superman's trial, are an example of the injustice wrought upon democracy and lower-class citizens by the ruling class. This is once again best exemplified by Senator Finch herself, who, despite doing the right thing and remaining uncorrupted, suffers the same fate and execution as the complacent Senator Barrows, as a result of Luthor's meddling and interference. Aside from the influence of class, the character of Lex Luthor is also used as a tool for the film to make statements about the United States government as a whole, mainly that it has fallen into decay and cannot be relied on to dispense justice. Along with a commentary of U.S. foreign policy examined through the lens of Superman himself, the film explores the failures of U.S. domestic policy through characters like Senator Finch, Lex Luthor, and Bruce Wayne. A billionaire himself, Bruce Wayne is heir to an ancestral family home which, in the film, has fallen into massive decay and collapse. Another deconstructionist departure from the source material, where Wayne Manor is typically the luxurious home of Bruce Wayne rather than a monument to his family. In the monument case presented by Dawn of Justice, Wayne Manor is a decrepit, burned-out husk of a building which bears a striking resemblance to the White House following its burning by the British in the War of 1812. Aside from connections to U.S. government, the lonely, isolated destruction of Wayne Manor stands in stark contrast to the bright, colorful galas thrown by Wayne's foil in the film, Lex Luthor. While Snyder's depiction of Wayne Manor illustrates the burden of legacy, wealth, and exploitation on a single man, Bruce Wayne, Luthor deals with the inherited legacy of his father as a means to continue exploitation of others and further his own goals, mainly to ensure that his place at the top of every sphere of influence is not disrupted by someone like Senator Finch or Superman. Snyder does not portray the rich in a positive manner. Aside from Luthor, he uses Bruce Wayne as a vessel to explore where wealth and power without humanity lead a person. This is on display in a number of scenes, perhaps most prominently prior to Batman's fight against Superman. Standing in the filthy, windswept main hall of Wayne Manor, Alfred attempts to dissuade Bruce from going to the battle against Superman, telling Bruce that he cannot win the fight and he will die. Bruce responds by saying,
"I'm older now than my father ever was. This may be the only thing I do that matters."
20 years of fighting criminals amounts to nothing.
Criminals are like weeds, Alfred. Pull one up, another grows in its place. This is about the future of the world. It's my legacy. You know, my father sat me down right here, told me what Wayne Manor was built on.
Railroads, real estates, and oil.
First generation made their fortune trading with the French. Pelts and skins. They were hunters.
So falls the House of Wayne.
Terrio is calling back to and building upon a number of themes and ideas here, most prominently those relating to Marxism and colonialism. Bruce refers to the first generation of his family as hunters, while also mentioning their connection to the French trappers living in early America. A Marxist reading of the scene requires one to look at how these trappers and hunters gained their fortunes, which was by, of course, hunting and selling animal pelts for profit, often until the natural resources and animal populations in those regions were pushed to near extinction. Most of this also occurred in direct conflict with Native Americans, who depended on those resources for survival, while the hunters exploited them for profit. This profit explosion led to the creation of family empires like the fictional Waynes, who then went on to expand their fortunes through modern markets like railroad, real estate, and oil, each of which present their own forms of class exploitation and unjust systems. In staying focused on the Waynes themselves, however, it must be noted that their depictions as people and characters often vary. Bruce's father, Thomas Wayne, has been portrayed as alternatingly philanthropic and exploitative. Dawn of Justice provides no real characterization of Thomas or Martha, other than what is seen in the opening credits, which depicts their deaths. Bruce, however, is at his core an altruistic man with a vested interest in the success and well-being of those economically below him. In the opening scene of the film, Bruce is shown sprinting towards disaster and certain death in a fruitless effort to save a group of Wayne Enterprises employees trapped in a building during a battle from the previous film, Man of Steel. Bruce is on the phone with one of his employees as the man dies, and watches as the Wayne Industries building Metropolis crumbles as a result of Superman's battle with General Zod. The death of his employees as nothing more than collateral damage due to the Kryptonians fighting the city is what contributes to Bruce's hatred of Superman. This can once again be connected to the desert intervention sequence, wherein events are altered to implicate Superman in mass collateral damage. It also once again displays Luthor's ability to prey on existing public feelings to further his own agenda due to his unique set of vast resources. Contrast Bruce's sincere care for his employees with Luthor's indifference for his own. When he destroys the U.S. Capitol, Luthor also willingly and without remorse kills his close associate and employee, Mercy Graves, never so much as acknowledging her death in the film. He does, however, exploit Bruce's guilt over the loss of the Wayne Industries employees by sending Wayne newspaper clippings about the death of Wayne's employees during the Metropolis battle, along with the quote, "You let your family die." This is especially traumatizing for Bruce, as he watches his parents get gunned down in the street as a young boy. Luthor takes advantage of the genuine, family-esque way Wayne views his employees, while using his own indifference to his employs as yet another means to further his ends. Yet, even through this contrast to Luther, Snyder and Terrio do not give Bruce a free pass. Bruce's desire to kill Superman is depicted as misguided, especially by Alfred, who in the Wayne Manor sequence points out that Bruce is overlooking the work they have done ridding Gotham of criminals. Bruce brushes off criminals as expendable. Additionally, Bruce violently murders a slew of criminals throughout the film, showing no regard for their lives or circumstances. This is what prompts Superman and Clark Kent, to confront Batman, as he is uncomfortable with Batman's harsh manner of dealing with criminals. Along Marxist lines, however, most criminals Batman combats are blue-collar or exploiting impoverished communities. For instance, in the character's introduction, he brands, but does not kill, a human trafficker. The film establishes that the Bat brand of justice means criminals marked there will be killed in prison by other inmates, and though Batman knows this, he continues to brand them, the criminals. In the case of the human trafficker, he is initially sent to a prison where he will not be killed for his brand, only for Lex Luthor to have him transferred to a different location in Metropolis, knowing he will be killed and thus once more interfering in justice in another person's life. Upon begging a prison guard not to send him to the yard, the trafficker is answered with, "You should be thanking the taxpayers of Metropolis for taking in your branded ass." The man is then killed. Bruce draws a hard line between guilty and innocent, and the film is critical of his judge, jury, and executioner-esque stance on justice. Batman killing criminals was a point of major criticism when the film was released, mainly from comic book fans who felt this was a betrayal of the character. This is correct, and is the entire point of Batman's arc in the film. Through the character of Superman, Terrio and Snyder attempt to say that Batman is not dispensing justice and needs to change his ways. While doing reporting in Gotham, Clark encounters a man who warns him, Clark, to get out of Gotham before dark because of Batman, saying,
"Well, there's a new kind of mean in him. He is angry, and he's hunting."
Traditionally, the bat symbol is used by the Gotham police when they need Batman's help. In Dawn of Justice, this is never the case. Instead, it appears on a lottery ticket held by what is presumably a poor man. The man's line and action illustrate that Batman no longer cares about helping others, but instead about taking out his anger on them. It also links him economically to some of these other Marxist arguments you'll find in other places in the script. This conversation also foreshadows Bruce's later line about being a hunter in the Wayne family tradition, his return to the Marxist role of exploiter. Deeply traumatized by the death of his parents and deeply traumatized by the death of his family in Metropolis, Dawn of Justice depicts Bruce Wayne as an uncharacteristically dark, angry, and brooding man on a path of self-destruction. He is never happy and does not fit in with the rest of the world, billionaires included. He has no true family to speak of and no one to share his life with. When he leaves to battle Superman, Alfred's line, "So falls the House of Wayne," is the ultimate indication of Bruce's self-destruction. The line and setting are also clear references to the fall of the House of Usher, which is about the similar ruination of a great family through death and loss and inability to move on from grief. Through this allusion and characterization of Bruce, the film is making a statement on how easily a so-called noble or just or powerful institution can fall into injustice, decay, and collapse. Bruce has become an exploiter just like Luthor, despite his best intentions not to. In a scene where Bruce attends Luthor's gala to raise money for the Metropolis Library, some of the film's clearest views of the rich and 1%er scene. Bruce Wayne only attends the gala to steal something from Lex, and while there intentionally stumbles around and acts like a fool in order to blend in. He feigns drunkenness, derides the nature of charity in books, and all in all puts on an arrogant air of stupid indifference. In short, he acts the complete opposite of himself. He acts the way he views other billionaires. When Clark Kent attempts to interview Bruce trails off, his eyes following a random woman's remarks, "Wow, pretty woman, bad habit, don't quote me." He then tries to leave the interview, and only returns when Clark asks him a critical question about Batman. Later in the film, Bruce Wayne attends an artifact auction with Diana Prince/Wonder Woman. The scene begins by showing a group of black waiters gather around a small television, watching a news report about Superman, only to have one of the auction employees burst into the kitchen and demand they get to work, followed by a hard cut to the black waiters serving rich attendees of the gala food and champagne while the attendees laugh, utterly oblivious to the problems which had the waiters' eyes glued to the screen. One of the curators takes a glass from the waiter, then ham-fistedly whisks Diana away to show the sword of Alexander, explaining in great detail its history and properties. He leaves her alone with the sword, and Bruce Wayne appears. The two then have a brief exchange, discarding everything the curator has just said as false and making him look like a fool. This is the real Bruce Wayne, knowledgeable and sincere, a stark contrast to the inane bluster of the curator, or the face present at Luthor's gala. In these two scenes, Dawn of Justice shows most clearly what it thinks of the 1% in general. They are oblivious, selfish, and demanding people detached from the real world. It is also important that the sword scene takes place in a building filled with historical artifacts, most of which are famously taken from exploited and abused peoples around the world, similar to the Pelt/Hunter narrative told by Bruce later in the film. The last caveat of how Bruce's psyche is dictated by his class upbringing can be seen in the film's opening credits, when Thomas and Martha Wayne are killed by a blue-collar criminal in a robbery. The murder of the Waynes is one of the most famous scenes in comic book history, but it always has a different connotation depending on how the Waynes are depicted, altruistic or selfish in that medium. As mentioned, Dawn of Justice offers no real look at Wayne's personalities. The most which can be said of either can only be said of their actions and their death scene. Thomas Wayne, in typical Snyder male bravado, briefly attempts to stop the attacker before being killed. This leaves Martha and Bruce, leading to one of the most visually striking images in the entire film. Before shooting Martha, Joe Chill's pistol gets caught in a pearl necklace she's wearing as a result of her also trying to knock his gun aside, as Thomas did. The necklace wraps around the breech, and when Chill pulls the trigger, the breech's movement rips the necklace, sending white pearls rolling to the dirty gutters of Gotham. Martha dies, Joe Chill flees, and Thomas Wayne's last word as he looks at his wife's body is Martha. Intercut with the sequence is a young Bruce Wayne fleeing his parents' funeral, a still regal Wayne Manor in the background, into the woods while leaves fall around him. Young Bruce falls down an abandoned well, while Martha's pearls fall into the gutter, and an adult Bruce narrates.
There was a time above, a time before. There were perfect things, diamond absolutes. Things fall, things on earth. And what falls is fallen.
The sequence and Bruce's narration depict the idea of the noble rich as fallen. The Wayne legacy has fallen, and the rich can be killed just as easily as the poor. Martha's pearls falling into the sewer are Snyder's visual representation of how little separates the rich from the poor. It is, of course, also the beginning of Bruce Wayne's lifelong trauma, or his fall. As for Luthor himself, he is the simple embodiment of all the evils which inhabit the ruling class. He is controlling, selfish, and erratic. He has no regard for the lives of others and is perfectly willing to sacrifice them, as seen in his treatment of Mercy Graves. Yet, interestingly, Luthor is functioning under the weight of an unrequested family legacy similar to Bruce. Lex is named after his father and runs his father's company, LexCorp. Luthor's father died when Lex was young and his mother was absent. He is a similarly estranged orphan-like figure to Bruce. One of the most telling lines regarding Lex's relationship with his father comes in the scene wherein Lex meets Senator Finch and Barrows.
Oh, ahoy, ahoy! I did not know you were here. Man on the marquee. No, don't believe it. My father named the company after himself. He was the Lex in front of the corp. How you doing?
Oh, really great.
Really great? Good. Follow me. No, Dad started saying that he named the company after his kid had investor pitches. Rich old ladies. They thought it was very cute, you know. Write checks for Lex.
Unlike Bruce, who inherited a family legacy in business, Lex inherited a single man's legacy built on a lie. Luthor is motivated by pure self-interest, and his family name is an example of the corruption and fall from nobility experienced by the upper classes in Snyder's universe. Unlike Bruce, who's able to uplift and rebuild himself through others at the end of the film, Luthor concludes the film alone, in prison, just as any blue-collar criminal would have. He does not escape justice, though he is seen to have broken out of the prison at the end of the following film, Justice League, but the mechanics and theme of that film are different from Dawn of Justice. And, in a way, this film was bookended by two very different examples of the rich being brought down to the same level as the poor. The most common method in which Dawn of Justice depicts, motivates, and explores its characters and themes come from an over-reliance of subtext and exploration of meaning in Barthes' obtuse form, rather than in a more traditional informative or symbolic form, which would be the standard fare for a big-budget superhero film. A lack of critical reading of the film and its themes, especially through the lens of justice, will result in a shallow view of the film at best, and a fundamental misunderstanding of it at its worst. However, in the case of Dawn of Justice, one cannot find answers simply by evaluating the text in the obtuse form. Even when broken down in such intimate capacity, Dawn of Justice is still a suspiciously inconclusive film concerning its wider themes and lack of definitive statements or answers about those themes. The reason for this is that, as Richard Brody wrote for The New Yorker, that even at his most pedestrian or bombastic, Snyder makes a far more engaging film than Christopher Nolan ever did, because Nolan presumes to know and to show, whereas Snyder wants to see. Even his slender philosophical world seems like he's discovering it, not delivering it. The style of Snyder and Terrio in Dawn of Justice is not to give the audience concrete answers to the questions about the implications of a mythological presence like Superman. It leaves those answers to the audience. This is part of the thematic reason Luther interrupts Superman's trial before a verdict can be reached. Not only is he intervening in the search for justice, but also the search for truth and answers. Snyder and Terry have no interest in answering their own questions for the viewer. They raise questions and make vague commentary about specific ideas, such as the role of the rich in perpetuating and suffering others, but they do not give concrete solutions or ways to circumvent these moral quandaries. The most definitive statement the film makes comes in the form of reformed Bruce Wayne at the end of the film, who, when visiting Lex Luthor in prison as Batman, does not brand him. His time as judge, jury, and executioner is gone, washed away by the humanistic sacrifice of Superman in the film's climax. Accompanying this is Bruce's assertion at Clark Kent's funeral that
man is still good.
But this line could just as easily be changed to is, I am still good. Or perhaps, men are still just. Okay, so I know that video was a lot. There might be some overanalyzing there and, a lot of references to weird stuff that I probably didn't use properly. But I think a lot of those points still stand. And while I'm interested in talking about Batman v Superman and Zack Snyder, I don't want to do it in the traditional way and getting into all the petty bickering and bitching and whining that usually results in. This was the type of video I wanted to make about Batman v Superman because it kind of analyzes parts of the film that I feel like got overlooked at the time of release and still do. And, views of Batman v Superman are starting to shift, and Man of Steel, I think people are liking them more than they did when they came out. I didn't like Batman v Superman when it came out. It wasn't until, later viewings that I started to appreciate it. I still think the movie has problems, but I think there's a lot of really good stuff going on there that people overlook. And I think it's unfortunate that if you try to point this stuff out, you get shit on and called like an idiot, and people will be like, what, have you never watched another movie before? And it's just really unfortunate. So I know I'm a pseudo-intellectual, and I don't presume to really know anything, but these are just some cool things that I noticed and observed about the movie, and I felt like it worked really well for what I was doing in my classes at the time. So I wrote this paper, my professor liked it, and, now months later I look at it, and there's some stuff I'd probably tweak, but I decided to adapt it to this video. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope maybe you learned something. And if you don't agree with any of my assessments, that's fine. It's not as if my opinion is fact. Obviously, I think I'm right, otherwise I wouldn't say it. But I'm open to hearing other people's, opinions and observations and disagreements. I'm not going to get upset about it. This is just a really interesting way to look at the film, I think. And I thought it'd be fun to bring some more like literary criticism into this type of film criticism. Not that there isn't already huge overlap between the two, but I just thought it'd be something worth looking at. So if you enjoyed this video, let me know and I'll try to make more like it. If you didn't enjoy it, let me know, and I probably won't make any more like it. Yeah, thanks for watching, and let me know what you think down below. Have a magical and mystical day. Farewell.